This is not a trade dispute. This is an economic war, and Washington just made a fatal misread. Just hours after Donald Trump threatened a 100% tariff on Canadian goods, Canada did not plead, Canada did not delay, Canada did not negotiate. Prime Minister Mark Carney responded with a single move that neutralized the threat entirely, a $70 billion annual Buy Canadian order. Steel, aluminum, lumber, locked, redirected, weaponized. Trump believed leverage came from dependence. He believed because 75% of Canadian exports flow to the United States, Canada would bend. Instead, Carney turned the Canadian federal government into the most powerful customer in the country, guaranteeing domestic demand so Canadian firms no longer need the United States to survive. This was not retaliation. This was strategic erasure. Every public project above $25 million, from Toronto's subway expansions to naval construction to national housing builds, now requires 100% Canadian-made materials. Overnight, American construction giants and defense contractors were locked out of one of their most reliable export markets. And Carney made it explicit. We cannot control what other countries do, but we can control our wallet. With $300 billion in planned spending over 5 years, Canada is building a supply chain that no longer asks permission from Washington. So here is the real question, and it should make the United States very uncomfortable. Why did Washington believe threats would work at the exact moment Canada was preparing to walk away? Pause here, because what comes next is where this backfires spectacularly. To understand why Trump's threat collapsed on contact, you have to understand the mechanics of modern supply chains and where the United States quietly became vulnerable. For decades, the United States treated Canada as a passive resource appendage. Canadian steel fed American construction. Canadian aluminum stabilized American manufacturing margins. Canadian lumber kept housing costs from exploding. This was not charity. It was a tightly balanced, just-in-time supply system, one optimized for low inventory, low buffer, and maximum efficiency. And that system only works when trust is stable. Here is the first number Washington ignored. More than 90% of the steel and aluminum used in Canadian federal infrastructure is sourced domestically. The constraint was never production capacity. The constraint was demand certainty. Carney solved that in one stroke. By redirecting $70 billion per year in government purchasing toward Canadian suppliers, Ottawa eliminated the single biggest risk Canadian firms faced: exposure to external political shocks from the United States. And here is the second number Washington misunderstood. Government procurement is not marginal demand, it is anchored demand. When the federal government guarantees long-term purchasing at scale, private capital follows, banks lend, factories expand, labor locks in, unit costs fall, marginal costs compress. Suddenly, exporting to the United States is no longer essential for profitability, it becomes optional. Now consider the threshold Carney set. Any project above $25 million must use 100% Canadian materials. This captures subway systems, defense procurement, ports, shipyards, energy infrastructure, and national housing builds. These are not symbolic projects. These are multi-decade contracts. This is where the economic logic turns brutal. American firms did not lose access to Canadian markets because of tariffs. They lost access because Canada removed the need to buy from them. Trump assumed leverage flows from trade volume. Carney understood leverage flows from who controls demand. And the most dangerous part for Washington is this: once a domestic supply chain is rebuilt around guaranteed demand, it does not revert. Factories are not dismantled. Workers are not laid off. Capital does not beg to return to dependency. The United States did not just threaten Canada, it incentivized Canada to become independent. And that sets the stage for the next phase, where this backfires inside the United States itself.
This is where Trump's strategy doesn't just fail abroad, it detonates at home. Because tariffs do not punish foreign governments, they punish domestic consumers, domestic firms, and domestic states first. Start with construction. American steel and aluminum exporters did not lose some Canadian business, they lost anchor contracts, the kind that stabilize revenue during downturns. Firms operating out of New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio had long treated Canadian public infrastructure as low-risk, repeat business. Those contracts are now gone, not delayed, not renegotiated, erased. A senior procurement advisor from a Northeast Construction Association put it bluntly in private briefings. This wasn't a tariff problem, this was a market exit. And markets don't reopen just because Washington changes its tone. Then comes housing. Canadian lumber has quietly moderated housing inflation across the northern United States for decades. When Trump floated a 100% tariff, futures markets reacted immediately. Builders in Maine, Minnesota, and Michigan saw cost projections spike within days. Developers paused projects, lenders tightened terms. And suddenly, local officials were facing the same question again. Why are housing costs rising again? Because tariffs compound. They do not stop at borders. They cascade through material costs, labor delays, and financing risks. Now look at defense. American defense contractors assumed Canada would remain structurally dependent on United States suppliers for naval systems, aerospace components, and heavy fabrication. The Buy Canadian mandate shattered that assumption. Once Canadian yards begin sourcing steel, aluminum, and components domestically or from European and Asian partners, the United States loses lock-in power. And defense supply chains, once diversified, do not reconverge. An industry analyst from the Midwest summarized the damage in one sentence: "We didn't lose orders, we lost relevance." And here is the political irony that makes this collapse unavoidable. The states hit hardest by this backfire, industrial swing states, are the same states Trump claims to defend. Workers do not hear strategic pressure, they hear layoffs, they hear canceled orders, they hear that Canada found a way to build without them. Trump framed tariffs as strength, voters experience them as instability. This is the core miscalculation. Trump believed fear would force compliance. Carney used certainty to dissolve leverage. Once Canadian firms no longer depend on the United States to stay profitable, American threats lose meaning. And once American exporters lose Canadian demand, Washington has no lever left to pull. The tariff threat did not scare Canada. It exposed the United States to its own weaknesses. And while Washington was postering publicly, something far more dangerous was happening quietly. Canada was building a way around the United States entirely. That counter-strategy is already in motion. While Washington was issuing threats, Ottawa was rewriting the map. Canada's response was not emotional, it was architectural. First, infrastructure. Behind closed doors, Canada accelerated rail, port, and logistics investments designed to route around the United States. Canadian Pacific Kansas City rail capacity was quietly rebalanced to prioritize east-west and north-south non-United States corridors. Atlantic ports were expanded to handle higher volumes bound directly for Europe. Pacific gateways were reinforced to lock in Asian demand. This was not diversification, this was decoupling by design. Second, procurement diplomacy. Canada did not retaliate alone, it synchronized. Mexico moved in parallel, quietly expanding joint procurement frameworks that allow Canadian steel and aluminum to flow into Mexican infrastructure projects without touching United States regulatory choke points. European partners signaled readiness to treat Canadian suppliers as preferred alternatives for public builds, defense components, and green infrastructure. This matters because procurement alliances are stickier than trade deals. Once standards, certifications, and supply schedules align, reversing course becomes expensive and politically toxic. Third, industrial anchoring. The Buy Canadian mandate created something Washington never anticipated, a permanent demand floor. With $300 billion committed over 5 years, Canadian manufacturers now operate with predictable order books. That allows long-term labor contracts, capital upgrades, and pricing power. Margins stabilize, volatility drops, exposure to U.S. political cycles becomes irrelevant.
This is the moment where leverage flips. The United States once believed Canada needed access to its market to survive. Now, Canadian firms can ask a far colder question. Why expose ourselves to United States risk at all? And here is the quiet dagger Washington missed. By excluding United States firms from Canadian public projects, Ottawa did not trigger a trade war. It triggered investment relocation. Capital that once flowed south to chase United States demand now stays north to serve guaranteed Canadian contracts. Factories follow certainty. Money follows certainty. Workers follow certainty. Trump's tariff threat assumed Canada would chase access. Carney built a system where access no longer matters. And once a country learns it can function profitably without you, influence collapses faster than any tariff can impose. This is not a temporary maneuver. This is a structural shift. Which brings us to the most dangerous phase of all, the moment where global power dynamics begin to realign around this rupture. Power in the modern world is not enforced by threats. It is enforced by reliability. And that is what the United States just shattered. For decades, allies tolerated Washington's volatility because the underlying system was predictable. Even when administrations changed, contracts held, supply chains endured, rules were bent but rarely broken outright. Trump broke the rule that matters most. Don't turn allies into hostages. Once that line is crossed, trust does not return on a new election cycle. It evaporates permanently. Canada's pivot sends a message far beyond North America. It tells middle powers everywhere that coercion from Washington is no longer a temporary inconvenience, it is a systemic risk. And when allies start planning for risk, they plan for exit. Even if Trump leaves office, the damage remains. Canadian factories built under Buy Canadian mandates will not shut down. Procurement frameworks aligned with Europe and Mexico will not dissolve. Capital that learned to avoid United States exposure will not forget the lesson. This is how influence dies, not loudly, but quietly, through redundancy. Now look at who benefits. China does not need to threaten Canada. It offers certainty, long-term contracts, infrastructure financing, stable demand. The same logic applies to Russia's resource diplomacy and Europe's industrial consolidation. When Washington weaponizes access, others monetize stability. The United States once dominated North America by being indispensable. Now it is teaching partners how to make it optional. That is the irreversible shift. Geopolitical power depends on being the default choice when things go wrong. Trump's tariff threat ensured the United States will no longer be that default.
not for Canada, not for Mexico, and eventually not for others watching closely. The tragedy is that none of this was necessary. The United States did not lose power because Canada defied it. The United States lost power because it misused it. And history is unforgiving to powers that confuse fear with respect. Which leaves us with one final unsettling question about leadership, cooperation, and the price of short-term aggression. Power is not the ability to threaten. Power is the ability to be trusted. Washington forgot that distinction and paid for it in silence, not spectacle. Trump believed tariffs were weapons. Carney understood that wallets are fortresses. One side relied on fear, the other relied on structure. One tried to coerce behavior, the other removed dependence. This is not the end of United States influence, but it is the end of careless influence. Once allies learn how to function without you, every future threat sounds hollow. Every demand feels optional, and every negotiation begins with the question, do we even need them anymore? Canada answered that question first. Others are watching closely. So here is the debate that matters, and it should divide the comments section sharply. Did Trump's aggression expose a momentary miscalculation, or did it reveal that the era of United States economic dominance has already passed? Because if power now belongs to those who offer certainty instead of coercion, then this was not just a policy failure. It was a historic turning point.